3, 2, 1. Good evening and welcome to Thursdays with NAMI. My name is Peg Morrison and I'll be your host for the evening. I'm the Director of Programs with NAMI North Carolina. Thursdays with NAMI is our way of connecting and building community, building conversations around the topic of mental health. Tonight's theme is injustice, race, and recovery. Gandhi said we need to make injustice visible. With the advent of smartphones, people have been documenting their everyday lives, which has made injustice much more visible to a lot of us. We've seen the chilling experience of people of color, African American folks in particular, in recent weeks and years. Experts are now calling racial trauma and racism itself a public health crisis. We're going to explore that in just a few minutes with our guests, Victor Armstrong, Dr. Michelle Laws, and Lacy Flintall. First, a quick word from our sponsors. I'm going to show you our beautiful logo. Thursdays with NAMI is funded in part by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Mental Health, Substance Abuse Services, and Developmental Disabilities. Our block grant comes from the Community Mental Health Services Block Grant Fund, which comes in turn from the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. We really do appreciate the division's guidance and supports. All right, let me stop sharing my screen real quick here. And there we go. So the first half of our show, as usual, will be a conversation with our guests. At around 7:45, we'll show our video of the week. And then we're going to spend some time answering your questions in our virtual studio audience. Moving right along, Thursdays with NAMI is recorded, so if you have friends who couldn't be here tonight, please tell them it's never too late. Thursdays with NAMI will be downloaded onto our YouTube channel within just a few days. We look forward to seeing you there. Back to our topic, we've known that Black folks are overrepresented with police arrests and incarceration. The data has been there for years, but video makes it real to many more people. You cannot watch the death of George Floyd or Eric Garner, both of who were suffocated by police officers while clearly saying repeatedly, "I cannot breathe." You can't watch that and not be affected. Each of tonight's guests has a combination of insight and expertise to help us grapple with these difficult questions surrounding racism and racial trauma. We hope to have this conversation tonight and walk away with a feeling of hope, a feeling of connection, some idea of what we can do to make the world a little brighter. So without any further ado, thank you to our guests for coming to the show and your willingness to discuss this hot topic. I know I wasn't able to give you very much notice because we were trying to respond promptly to current events. Victor Armstrong, I'll read your awesome bios now. Victor is the Director of the North Carolina Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services. With over 30 years of experience in human services, he has dedicated his career to building and strengthening community resources to serve individuals living with mental illness. He's an author and international speaker on suicide awareness, particularly as it relates to underserved communities. He's the former board chair of NAMI North Carolina and currently serves on the board of directors of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention of North Carolina. Dr. Michelle Laws. Michelle Laws is the Assistant Director of Consumer Policy and Community Engagement at the aforementioned Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services. Her previous professional roles include legislative and policy work, both at the division and at NAMI North Carolina. She was the Executive Director of the North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP, that's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, from 2014 to 16. And finally, it's my pleasure to welcome Lacy Flintall. He is the Youth Transition Program Director at North Carolina Families United. He interned there 6 years ago as a member of Youth Move. He was also a graduating senior at Ohio University at that time. He has lived experience as a youth transitioning through the North Carolina juvenile and adult justice system while coping with behavioral health challenges. Today, Lacy uses those experiences to propel his advocacy for youth connecting them to natural supports and resources as they navigate systems of care. Greetings, panelists. How are you all doing tonight?
Very well, thank you.
Doing well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Doing great. Thank you.
All right, so my first question is really basic. How's everyone caring for yourself these days? We live in interesting times.
Yeah, we do. Very interesting times. I think for me, there are a number of things. One is, I'm one of those people that routine is important to me. So there are certain things I try to do every day. I try to do some bit of exercise every day. I try to take, some time just to kind of unplug from the consistent bad news that we see on television, unplug from social media. Take some time just to kind of get into my own head a little bit. But the other thing for me that's really therapeutic for me is just trying to put out good messages, good vibes. So I do use social media. I try to post things daily, things that reflect on the times that we're living in, but also try to provide some little bit of hope. So that's, that kind of helps to keep me balanced. I try to make sure I stay balanced mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally, and all that kind of feeds into that.
Mm-hmm.
Same here. I start each day, for the most part, with prayer and meditation. It is so easy for me to go to that place of worrying and being anxious about things. I am empathetic by nature and very compassionate. And so other people's struggles and challenges easily, I absorb those into my spirit. And so for me, my spiritual grounding is extremely important for the work that I think I'm called to do in a lot of ways. Trained, yes, and prepared to do, but certainly I think called to do. And so I try to stay in tune with my higher power, God, and also try and walk, which I found to be very therapeutic early in the morning, but that's kind of hard because some of our meetings start at like 7:30 these days. That's focused on COVID, but similar things. I don't utilize social media as much as I used to. I do follow Victor, and his posts are encouraging and inspiring. But again, I try and block out a lot of information. And for me, that means kind of just saying, I'll pop on and I'll pop back off. But I think we're at a place now where it's important for all of us to lift our voices and to speak
Absolutely.
out and to also send out positive messages. So.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, I agree with the sentiments of with Victor and Dr. Michelle Laws. I personally like to spend time with my family. I know that amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, our work days seem to get a bit longer for some reason. Now they start a little earlier and they finish a little later. I don't know how that all took place, but I think I'm going with the flow and making the most of it, but also making sure that to piggyback off what Victor said, making sure that there's some balance there to where I can where it allows me to be me. And a large part of me being me is helping others. When I'm in that element, I feel as a natural element for me, and I feel at peace, at one, and I'm calm. But also when I'm spending time with my loved ones, my friends, my family, engaging in positive conversation and just being surrounded by love and positivity and as the phrase that Victor used, good vibes, that makes a large difference in making sure that I'm well, and also staying in my wellness toolbox and each day and going through that routine, as Victor mentioned as well. And I think Dr. Laws, you said as well, that waking up in the morning, meditating, whether it be with essential oils diffusing, or whether it be with music playing in the morning, or just trying to keep myself in a good mood. And for the most part, it's been successful. Again, I said, as we mentioned, being on social media these days, or using the internet or watching the news, you can sometimes get bombarded with negative energy and a lot of negative content. So just being mindful of that balance and that, and making sure that you don't tip to one side or the other. So,
yeah. Well, I so relate to all of that. Just trying to keep positive, trying to make sure that whatever energy I'm putting out there is positive and helpful, constructive. And that tension between wanting to keep up with the news, but not wanting to let negative energy, because I hook into it. I hook into the negativity and I carry it with me. So I relate to all of that. Our first question is going to go to Victor. Touching on current events, speaking of sad headlines, it's heartbreaking that in the same day we had the murder of George Floyd and a clear act of violence from a white woman who called police after a Black gentleman had the audacity to say, "Please leash your dog" in Central Park. Because obviously pointing law enforcement at a Black male is typically setting him up for serious trouble, warranted or not. That was a rough day. How can we make this a turning point to move in a positive direction? What would that take?
So, from my perspective, it takes a combination of things. I think for one thing, we're seeing right now that we're at a point where we're seeing the results of complex trauma that has been inflicted upon people of color throughout our history. And we're seeing the results of that now. I think that's some of what you're seeing come out with some of the frustration and the anger that people are experiencing. But I think a lot of it begins with us having some conversation and trying to come to some common understanding about where we are and about how we got here. I also think that it's important for us not to look away from this moment. I think we need to feel the weight of it. We need to understand that we are at a very pivotal time, and the inclination is to not want to acknowledge what's going on. But I think the fact that we're seeing these things play out over and over on the news and we see them in social media, it's put us in a position where as a nation, we can't look away this time. I mean, historically, we've been able to find some rationale behind why things happen. But when you see all these things happening in rapid succession, and you can't even look away from the disparate impact of COVID-19 on African American community and communities of color. You see that happening, that brought to light a lot of the health disparities, and then you see the way that things play out in the justice system, the way that things played out with African Americans encountering law enforcement, and even in the situation with the lady that you referenced in Central Park. She had an opportunity there, and we don't like to hear and have conversations about privilege. It's a very touchy subject when we talk about white privilege. But one of the white privileges is that she was able to all of a sudden weaponize her whiteness to use against this African American man who had done nothing to her. So I think that we're at a place where if we're going to move beyond this, we have to see it for what it is. We have to acknowledge that there have been historic disparities that have brought us to this point. This is not something that just occurred. This is something that's been building over decades and centuries. And part of the frustration that you're seeing bubble to the surface from people of color is, at some point, you ask the question, what am I supposed to do? When Colin Kaepernick took a knee, he was told, you're disrespecting the flag, so you need to find another way to protest. When we've complained and lifted our voices, they haven't been heard. When you've seen African Americans that have lost their lives to law enforcement in the past, and you say, leave it to the justice system, the officer gets exonerated. And at some point, people are saying, what else do you want me to do? And you see the rage and you see the anger come out. And I think we have to recognize that this situation is a situation that we as a country created. And because we created this, we can't look away from it. We have to accept the fact that we have to have some systemic change. Otherwise, we're not going to get past this, and it's only going to get worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And your comment about having to admit what's there, I thought of Ahmaud Arbery, the jogger who was killed for really no reason at all by a gentleman who tailed him in a truck with their guns, and nothing happened until there was a splash in the media.
Yeah.
Talk about disturbing.
And I think that's also why, and then I'll stop talking in a minute, but I think that's also why you know, we have to rethink where we are now in terms of how we utilize law enforcement, you know, where we need to go with police reform, even the way we look at our system of justice, because for people of color, it is not a justice system. It has not been, we have not received justice. And even to label people that go into the jails and prisons as offenders or ex-offenders, you know, that's also a misnomer, because there are a lot of folks who are incarcerated who were not offenders, at least not to the extent that they were made out to be. So I think that there's got to be a lot of reform in our policing and our justice system. But we've also got to change the way that we think about the justice system, you know, even in terms of how there's this perception that Black people are criminals, that, you know, you must have done something wrong, otherwise you would not have ended up in that situation. And, you know, one of the things that I think people don't really understand about the way the criminal justice system works and the way that crime stats are compounded is that, you know, when people say, well, Black people commit so many other crimes, or Black people don't police their own neighborhoods, the crime stats are not measures of crimes committed, they're measures of crimes reported. And if you are disproportionately stopping and frisking and calling the police on someone for walking in the park, then you're going to pad those numbers. And so the impact is going to be that because Black people are more highly policed and the police are more highly called on Black people, that we are going to represent a disproportionate number of the
And I have to, if I may, I know it was Victor's question to answer, but if I may, I'd like to also add, you know, the wonderful work that Michelle Alexander did and published in her book, The New Jim Crow, several years ago, where she made a very cogent and convincing argument that the justice system in and of itself was designed for Blacks and also poor people who were, you know, considered disposable, right? And so it's part of the structural inequalities that have been in place for a long, long time to really subjugate and to terrorize and traumatize Black bodies. And so the mere fact that policing is that you see more African Americans apprehended, charged, surveilled, and charged and sentenced. When you look at the drug use rates, for example, we know the whole influx of or over incarceration that came out of the crack epidemic that really was crippling Black communities and other communities in the 80s. When you look at the use of drugs, and we won't talk about the disparities in the crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, which led to some of the disparities in the sentencing, but when you look at actual drug use data, you find that there are no statistically significant differences in terms of who use. And in fact, you may find that in some indicators that African Americans are less likely to use certain substances. And so, but they are more likely to be arrested and charged and sentenced for those. And so it gets to the structural inequities that have brought people out into the streets in mass all around this country. George Floyd was simply a light that was you know, a match that was thrown already into a kindled fire, and it just started it back up. So I think of it like you know, setting a fire in a fireplace, and the kindle goes down and it's simmering, but you know not to take those ashes and put them in the trash can, because the fire is still you know, there's still danger that the fire could reignite. And that's what George Floyd did. His case did. It simply reignited. Not to mention, we have a president who is very reckless with the use of his words, and words have power. And he too has contributed to some of what we're seeing.
I would agree with that. Yeah, definitely divisive messaging coming out of the White House, use of code words and what do they call them, dog whistles. The people hear language a certain way and it pushes that button. Lacy, did you want to add anything?
I think that we spoke a lot on this question, and I just, for the sake of time, I know we have a few more questions, several more questions to get to. I just wanted to add that maybe when it says the end part of that question is what will that take, and to elaborate upon some of the things that Dr. Laws and Mr. Armstrong have spoken of, I would say a willingness to listen, just to listen, and a willingness to change. Up to this point, I think we are where we are when Mr. Armstrong mentioned the state of where we're at today and how we've arrived to this point because of a lack of willingness to change. Even in times where we've been heard, there wasn't a willingness to change. Like, okay, I hear you, but there's nothing I'm going to do about it. It's nothing significantly, anyways, in reference to policy change. And we would need to unlearn some of the behaviors and the normal way of like, hey, this is just the way it's always been. We'd have to unlearn some of those things and relearn a different way of going about doing things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, all good points. I appreciate y'all. So the next question is to Michelle. As we've been discussing, the effects of racism include anxiety, trauma. For Black folks already living with mental illness, the weight of that oppression has to be incredibly heavy. How can we support them?
So I think one, recognizing the pain that people are experiencing, and not in a patronizing way, but I think one of the ways in which we continue to traumatize people who are traumatized, and particularly in this instance, African Americans or Blacks, who, especially those of us who have lived experience, those of us who have family members with lived experience, is to minimize their trauma and minimize their pain. And so one is not to force people to have to explain why they see things a certain way or why they are experiencing things a certain way. And I think having to educate, in this instance, when we're talking about racial trauma, having to educate white people. I've said this in a Facebook Live thing. I used to be a huge supporter of implicit bias training. I think that's important for people to learn. But some of these outright frontal assaults against Black bodies and traumatizing of Black people gets down to a question and issues about humanity. So I think one of the ways you support is not asking people to continue to take race, and especially Black people, to continue to learn about implicit bias. Not saying that there's not room for all of us to learn, but I think recognizing, one, that the pain is real, and we don't, and there's not a lot of patience in having to explain that over and over and over again, having to explain why you should tap into your humanity and see all of us equally and the same way. It's an issue and a question of humanity, and not folk necessarily, from my perspective, not understanding what implicit bias is. That's important, but that's not what will take someone onto the streets, take a Black man down and put their knee for 8 minutes, 8 minutes, and leave it there, and especially when they're saying they can't breathe. That's not what causes someone to follow a young Black boy with Skittles and a thing of tea around a neighborhood that he lives in and ultimately take his life. That's not, implicit bias is not what drives somebody to continue to keep a man in a stronghold who is on the ground saying, I can't breathe, as in the Eric Garner case. Implicit bias, to me, is not, or the lack thereof, understanding it, is not what causes someone to shoot a child on a playground. because they thought he had a real gun, shot first, and didn't even ask questions, but shot first. To me, that gets to the core of our humanity. And so seeing, recognizing that, and not forcing people to do that extra work of, tell me how you, I know that must made you feel really bad. Tell me how that made you, what can I do to make you feel better? One, you can, kind of talk to people who will listen to you and who can identify with you. And so acknowledging the pain, being just there, supportive, and saying we are in this together, and really meaning it and demonstrating it through actions. And then also finally, people speaking out when there are other things that, when there are things that don't affect their communities, but speaking out where they're not the victim, but speaking out. So it's going to take white law enforcement officers saying, you know what? No, we're not having that on our watch. It's going to take all law enforcement officers as well. So really speaking out when you're not the victim, I think is, and yes, this kind of dialogue, having this kind of dialogue Suzanne, is extremely important to this. So one, recognizing people's pain, and recognizing that not forcing them to do extra work to kind of help find the solution.
If I could add something real quick, because I think there's some, and I agree with everything that that Michelle said. I also think that part of the issue that we face is we don't have resources in communities of historically marginalized populations. The behavioral health resources, the medical resources are not in our communities. For a lot of folks who are people of color who enter into the mental health system, their first encounter is often in the back of a police car or in an acute care emergency department. Neither one of those is conducive to good outcomes. So part of what we have to do also, if we're going to meet the needs of people who are hurting, whether it's anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, whatever, among people of color, one of the things that we need to do is recognize that we need to put resources in the communities where people live. We need to be intentional about creating a pool of clinicians that look like us, because right now in America, only about 2% of psychiatrists, 2% of psychologists are Black, 4% of social workers are Black. And there's no self-respecting Black man who wants to go and sit on the couch of a 20-something blue-eyed white female and tell her, I cry all the time, I don't feel like getting out of bed in the morning, and my sex drive is low. So we need to figure out how to get people who look like us to talk to us. The other thing is, and it kind of goes back to what Lacy said in the beginning, is how we hear what people are saying. And it ties into what Michelle is saying too about understanding people's pain and where they come from. Because if I looked at the diagnosis for paranoid personality disorder, and there's some 8 criteria that you have to hit 4 of the 8. And if I go into your office after a bad day and I tell you about my day, and it's things like, criteria are things like you feel like people are out to get you, or you think that people are, conspiring against you. But if I'm talking about my day, I guarantee you, I can hit 4 of those 8. But I would just be describing to you the life of a Black man in America. But if you don't understand my life, you would characterize that as something very different. So we have to understand where people are coming from if we're going to be able to help them.
Thank you for that. I hadn't quite thought of it through that lens, that there are certain life experiences that reinforce paranoia. And as a clinician, you could hear that in a really inaccurate way. That's very helpful. Lacy.
Yeah, well, not only did Victor do a great job answering that question in detail and in depth, he actually, I think, is just led on to some other things that I really want to talk about that struck with me personally, which I think I'll get the opportunity eventually if I just hold tight. But also to carry on to elaborate on that question as well, the minor pieces, I guess, like what could we say to help them cope? And it's at this point, I think that African American families are tired of hearing words. So I don't know if there's anything you say. And I read a quote once that said, "Apology without changed behavior is an insult in a sense." And I think that it's not anything that we need to say. It's more so along the lines of what we need to do And there's a lot as opposed to saying things to them that, but maybe the obvious: encouragement, empathy, compassion. Be humane. I guess the words, things that you would give, that you would say to anyone, that you would give anyone to help them cope with these with what's taking place in our country right now. But more so along the lines of action. I think that I think with Dr. Laws, the actions that she spoke of, that I guess that don't literally come, that don't specifically come from implicit bias, but just simply come from a lack of humanity, in a sense, just from a lack of compassion. Even in reference to, I know she mentioned the different instances with Eric Garner and with Tamir Rice and with Trayvon Martin and so forth. But even in reference to follow that up with, if you're not careful, you could find pictures on social media where there's a challenge where certain people are going around posting pictures with their knees on someone's neck and posting it for, and so these are things, what led that, and I agree with Dr. Laws, that didn't come from lack of knowledge of implicit bias. That just comes, that's a different type of hatefulness and trauma that is taking place on your own account, and I think that to help African American families cope with what's taking place it would be more so just change behavior, not to not say anything. Again, just a willingness to listen. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't the time to do it to say anything at that point. So.
Yeah, a lot to unpack here. There are a lot of systemic problems, a lot of challenges for the everyday person who wants to know what to do, but also how do we make healthcare more accessible? How do we reach out to people where they're at, and make things approachable? So, yeah, there's a lot going on there. Let's move on to our next question. I don't want to miss what you were wanting to say, Lacy, so let me know if we don't get to it.
Yes, we'll do, Pat.
Okay. Actually, this question is for you. I can only imagine the stress that African American families are feeling right now. Actually, you know what? We've covered this question. So, Lacy, why don't I just give you the floor? If you have a message you want to get out, go for it.
Oh, well, actually, I was going to speak about my own personal experiences and experiences of the youth that I work with today, that I encounter on a day-to-day basis, facilitating our evidence-based high-fidelity wraparound model here. Youth, African-American youth in general, or youth from low socioeconomic backgrounds or from urban communities with mental health and behavioral health challenges are, and you think about where you come from, what you look like and things of that nature, and you think about the increased odds of you being stopped by police, by being identified as a gang member, by or a security threat group, so to speak, is the terminology they use now in our state's justice system. And again, the microaggression that will come with these police encounters. It magnifies things, and it magnifies things to a level that it's almost unbearable. It's almost as if it's in the back of your mind that looms over you like a dark cloud when as a young person, when you're carrying about in your day-to-day activities. We, at this very moment in North Carolina, we have laws in our juvenile justice system that will categorize, depending on where I was at when who I was with when I committed the crime, will intensify my sentencing for a juvenile. And these policies and these laws have always been in place, but we don't want they're biased laws. I mean, so in the event that a youth in a lower socioeconomic area commits a crime and he's with his friends, if his friends are gang members, his peers that live in his neighborhood within a 1 to 2 mile radius of his parents' home or his or her parents' home, and they commit the crime with them as accomplices or co-defendants, the crime is then labeled as gang affiliated because of the people the peers that they would naturally hang out with each and every day, possibly even family members. But in the event that another youth who doesn't live in a low socioeconomic area commits a crime with his friends and who live within a 1 to 2 mile radius of his parents' home or her parents' home, and those are their co-defendants, then it's not related. It's not considered gang related because of the friends are not involved in the gang activity. So
is that just Excuse me, is that just based on zip code, or what is that coming from?
Not based on zip code. It's based on there are certain youth who may already have interacted or had run-ins with the system and have identified as security threat group members, and so as gang members. And with that being said, if I, so to speak, just perspective, was not a gang member but committed with me and my friends are committing juvenile type crimes, and we did it together, my crime now becomes a gang affiliated crime, and now puts me in a different level for sentencing. But at the discretion of the prosecuting attorney and the judge, which research has shown to not be as forgiving or not to be as giving in terms of cultural and racial, discrepancies. And with that being said, it magnifies it. Again, it's that dark cloud, and if I'm suffering from anxiety issues before, I'm really, things are really, I'm really anxious at this point, or and if I'm having trouble, it just puts me in a much more of a the word I'm losing the word that I want to use right now, but it's a really heavy weight that people from lower socioeconomic and people of color, African American males and females of especially at the youth level have to deal with. And I think what I wanted to get at is that something that Victor had mentioned was connecting these youth to services and providing them with practical ways of navigating through these systems, just practical ways of coping with these, with some of these worries that they may have that they're anxious of. Removing the stigma that comes with receiving these services as well. Myself personally, as a Black male growing up in the 90s, born in the late 80s, growing up in the 90s, my diagnosis was swept under the rug. It was, we need to pray about it, or we need to, or there were so many different things I was told, or he needs a whooping, or, and so forth and going on. But it was never, he needs some professional, he needs to seek for professional help and, clinical help. And so without, and by not doing it, things began to unravel and spin out and spiral out of control. But yet this is something that could have been addressed had I been connected to some of the supports and services that I needed. And like I said, that's a personal thing, but not only it's not personal on my own account, but also with the youth that I work with today. And again, removing that stigma, it's an uphill battle that I'm trudging and that we're all trudging, just trying to remove that stigma so that youth can receive mental health services. But also, again, the access to those services, as Victor mentioned again, are typically involuntary commitments into IVCs, into emergency rooms, and or social workers, removing them from the household, and again, where is that going to lead us? Realistically, what do we expect?
Lacy makes some really.
No, go ahead.
Lacy makes some really good good points, and one thing I wanted to add to what he said is there is the school to prison pipeline is real. There's evidence to show that little Black boys. There was earlier research by someone who Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu, who didn't make it into the mainstream canons of educational theory and mental health and so forth, but was at one point very, very popular among some of my peers. He wrote this compelling and persuasive, The Conspiracy to Destroy Young Black Boys, and it was a series of books that he did, but he documented by grade 4, Black boys have already experienced traumas that set them up for failure throughout school and for early exit from school through suspension and expulsion and an early entrance into the justice system. And that follows them. But what's also interesting, and then the justice system has a way of responding that further traumatizes. And I'm thinking of some of the work, Bruce Wright did, who was a judge, who wrote a book, Black Robes, White Justice, who documented his time on the bench. The other thing I want to say is we got to be mindful too that not just services, but culturally appropriate services, services that tap into the experiences of Black kids where they are and what they're familiar with. I know my godchild, we had custody because their mom had a co-occurring disorder and needed some time, and to keep them out of the system, we took them and we had them for almost 4 years before she was able to get them back. And so, you know, part of the counseling and services that were provided to one of them, I would sit in there and think, you know, this child is not, this is not going to work, right? But trying to you know, give the therapist her space to work, but sitting and watching and observing some of the therapeutic responses to kids who've experienced trauma, who've experienced abuse, all of the adverse childhood experiences that we talk about today. We have to make sure that we've got culturally competent providers out there. We also have to, on the other side of that, recognize that sometimes the treatment, the poor treatment of Black kids comes at the hands of Blacks themselves in the systems who have brought into and internalized these pathological ways of responding to their own. And so you've got, just because it's a Black face does not necessarily mean that's the best person, although we advocate for diversity and cultural congruency with patient and provider, but there's more to that too. And so we got to make sure that we got the right people providing these services.
When you look at, you know, systemically what's happening, and Lacy talked about a lot of what was happening with the kids that he was working with and some of the systemic challenges that set them up for failure. And the result of that is today, you know, African-American youth make up about 17% of the youth in this country, but we make up 40% of the kids in foster care, 45% of the kids in the juvenile justice system. There's something wrong with those numbers. And then that feeds into down the road where African-Americans as a whole, we make up 12% of the population, but make up half of the prison system. Black males make up half of the males in the prison system, and we make up about 40% of the homeless people in this country. So there are systemic things in the system that set us up for failure. And Dr. Laws talked about that school to prison pipeline, and there are places all along that pipeline where we could reach in and pull kids out, but instead we're funneling them into a system. When you have kids that grow up in foster care and in juvenile detention, we're also setting them up to have mental health issues down the road, because the more trauma they experience, the more anxiety they experience, the more likely they are to suffer from depression and other illnesses later on. So we've got to figure out a way to turn the system around. It cannot be that African-American families are just predestined and preordained to be dysfunctional to the point where 40% of the kids in foster care come out of Black homes. It can't be that there's something wrong with Black kids to the point where 45% of the kids in the juvenile justice system are Black. And it goes back to some of the things we talked about earlier about how we police and then how we intervene. I used to tell my son, I have 3 sons, and this is going to shock some people, but I have a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 27-year-old. But my 27-year-old, I used to have to sit down and talk to him all the time about how he conducts himself publicly. He had white friends. And I would have to tell him, you can't do what they do. You can't do the things that they do, because if they get in trouble, there's a different path for them. But I can't have you end up in the system. So we have to talk to our kids differently, because, and even when our kids, and I have an 8-year-old that we're just at the point of getting ready to sit him down and talk to him about how to act when you confront the police, because even an 8-year-old Black male can be perceived as a threat. And it's a shame that I have to tell my 8-year-old to have more situational awareness than this adult cop that's liable to confront you, because it could go badly if you don't show him your hands, if you don't speak respectfully, and if you don't, if you're not compliant. And that's a sad testimony, but that's the world that we live in, raising young Black boys.
And another thing, to Victor's point, and then Peg, I know you want to move on. In addition to setting them up for entering kids that go into foster care and the juvenile justice system, you're also setting them up to be victimized. They're not more likely to be perpetrators, but they certainly are more likely to be victimized of sex trafficking, human trafficking, victimized of being used by gangs to do all kinds of different things. So they are traumatized over and over and over again because of the system's lack of ability or response to meeting the true issues and causes and root causes of any mental health problems that they may have, any emotional problems that they may have. And the other thing is, there's this ongoing, these daily ongoing traumatic stressors. Dr. Everett Moon Parker once said at a Congressional Black Caucus Brain Trust that Black people don't suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, because that indicates that the stressor that triggered the trauma that triggered the stressor is post. She says that Blacks suffer from DOTS, daily ongoing traumatic stressors. Dr. Arlene Geronimus, we're hearing a lot of people reference her work on weathering. This ongoing, we age faster, our organs age faster because of the stressors and all of the effects that stress has on internally on our organs. Black men who have to give discussions or talks to their children, as well as Black mothers. I carry this. I don't know, I have to flip it over because it's his cell numbers on it. This is Ben Crump's card. He's a friend of mine that I met while we were doing the whole Trayvon Martin thing, and then Mike Brown. How many white people carry, like their license, the cards of, and I have my husband's number, because at one point I was known to get into trouble in terms of social justice and activism. I have people speak and programmed into his phone and mine, people who can post certain levels of bells. Really, I carry a card with Ben Crump's card and then some others with me, because I never know what is going to, as they say in some communities, pop off just
Michelle,
because of the color of my skin. How many white people have those kinds of thoughts?
Michelle, can I agree with you there? Can I stop you? I have my attorney's phone number and my Bill's bondsman's phone number programmed in my phone as an emergency contact, and it's almost because if I'm stopped, I need to call my attorney and put him on speakerphone or FaceTime him so he can see what's taking place. And yeah, I'm sorry, it just kind of triggered me. I'm sorry, Michelle. When you spoke up, Dr. Laws, I was like, yeah, you know what, this is a reality, a harsh reality, but it's a reality. Yeah, like
it's a reality. And after my first arrest for civil disobedience was down in Georgia, down in Newt Gingrich was in office at the time, and I was down there doing protests and stuff. But so that was the first arrest. That was a horrible, horrible, horrible experience. My second and third arrests were here in Raleigh. They took us, and it was protesting at the General Assembly, and one was at the Wake County School Board when they were trying to resegregate Wake County schools. And I'll never forget, they took us in, and they actually allowed us to keep our cell phones. The guy allowed me to take my mugshot multiple times, because I said, oh no, you will not have me in the slam of newspaper or magazine looking my mugshot looking. So he let me get my smile right, and then I thought about it in the second arrest where they treated us very nicely, and I said, even the privilege that we have This is not an experience that other people have in the justice system. Why is it that we get treated so humanely, and then other, criminals or people that you get treated so inhumanely? It's a decision that people are making, and it goes back to my earlier argument. It has nothing to do with without not understanding what implicit bias is. It's the decision to act humanely or not. And a lot of these kids, Black kids in particular, poor kids in particular, are not given the courtesy of being seen as and treated as human. Neither are people with mental illnesses. And we haven't talked about how many people with mental illness have been killed by police too, while they are in the middle of a crisis. And so that was I told y'all I would go off.
I would say this, Michelle, too, about choices, and just kind of make this analogy. Because I'm one of the folks that, I keep reminding people there are really two entities at work in our streets right now. You have the protesters and you have the rioters and the looters. They're not one and the same. Right. And when we intermingle the two, it diminishes the life of George Floyd, and it diminishes people who are protesting for human rights. But there are also those people who will, under the cover of darkness or under the cover of a crowd, seek to inflict pain on other people, given the opportunity. Not because they don't know better, but because they're angry and they want to hurt somebody. The difference is you have that happening with law enforcement. You have that happening with George Zimmerman. There are people who can hide under the cover of, I'm white, you're Black, I'm going to hurt you. So there are those people that make a conscious decision that because I'm angry with you and I don't like you, I'm going to hurt you. But rather than having to go out and do it under the cover of a protesting crowd, they can do it under the cover of, I'm white and you're Black.
All right. So I want to kind of summarize here. It's actually almost 8 o'clock, which is amazing. I'm really grateful to all of you for sharing your perspective, especially Lacy for sharing your story and putting that out there. And I want to make it clear that this was we decided to focus this show on the issue of race and recovery and injustice as a result of recent events, but we also will be moving forward with a more formal process for embracing race. It's going to be a key part of our strategic plan. It was just discussed at our board meeting this past weekend. Executive Director Gary Kreitz made it very clear this is going to be at the top of our list. So what I want to do is kind of summarize what we're talking about tonight, and I'm going to look at this as something that can help us define the terms of this conversation we want to have moving forward. And you can tell me if I'm getting this right, and then we'll, starting at 8, I think we'll go to the question and answer if that works for everybody. And I want to point out too, there are a lot of really positive comments in the chat box, questions and thank yous and agreements and accolades. So, but what I'm hearing is a really core fact that we need to establish. There's a difference between racial hatred and the kind of racism that's really more about I'm oblivious, I'm ignorant, I'm not woke. I mean, there's a difference just between those two, and it's pretty big. Implicit bias, a lot of us can be guilty of without realizing it, but sometimes, the violence, there's no excuse or no world where that's okay, or where someone didn't mean it. And white folks, we need to educate ourselves and be aware of the burdens that are being carried, the baggage. It's not your job to explain everything like, gee, why would you be upset about this or that? We need to understand that rioting is the language of people who have no voice. We need to understand the historical backdrop that creates a feeling of helplessness and powerlessness, and the rage that comes from being abused and mistreated over time, systematically, historically, on a level of microaggression and macroaggression. So I think we need to educate ourselves and be better partners and better allies. Cody Kindley mentioned a book, The Anti-Racist, that we're ordering here at NAMI North Carolina, intend to read. Another title that came up on our recent division discussion was Wilmington's Lie. We've also ordered that. So you know, we all need to educate ourselves, no matter the race, but really, I think the burden is in our court right now. And some of the highlights that we will want to focus on moving forward is the early intervention with a focus on that schools to prison pipeline. And I have heard, I'm not as familiar as Dr. Laws, of course, but I've heard NPR stories about the increased likelihood of a child being suspended or expelled at a very, very young age, preschool, kindergarten, early grade school, and how that escalates really pretty quickly into criminal justice involvement.
Normalizing the behavior. Sorry, Peggy, I couldn't even hold back, but normalizing the behavior of being in handcuffs sometimes, and normalizing being in a fence of rules and breaking rules. And if a child feels as if they don't want to be somewhere, and you've symbolized that, hey, I'm going to send you home when you're misbehaving, and so they, in turn, they decide, hey, I don't want to be here anymore, so each day I'll just come and misbehave so they can send me home. And the same thing, as you become an adult, you start talking about responsibilities and the rules of the world. And it's like, hey, I don't want to pay my rent. I don't want to pay a cell phone bill. This can all be gone if I simply break the law. It goes a lot deeper, and I think, and I'm sorry, Pigs, I know we don't have a lot of time, but this is something I really wanted to speak on that I don't think we got a chance to, was that also outside of the implicit bias and the just hateful racism, that there's another piece that I think that Victor and Michelle were both speaking to, and that was the systemic racism. And just like in terms of, financial systems, justice systems, educational systems, religious systems, it goes on. The systems that people of color are in no form or fashion any control of in any corner of the earth, and those systems those systems inflict racial trauma, because we're forced we're at the will of someone else, and we have no control over what is imposed on us in any form or fashion. And and that was something. And I think also, lastly, in terms of the conversation, and I promise this is the last thing, is in reference to the conversation of these honest conversations that need to be had around racism, the sense of urgency. Sometimes I think you mentioned earlier, prior to this, was the nonprofit author and blogger of Vu Lee, or yeah, okay, yeah. So I'm sorry for the mispronunciation, but there was the analogy was, if you wouldn't go through an entire dinner letting someone have spinach in their teeth, we would simply say, hey, you have spinach in your teeth. And you say, similarly, we should be able to say, hey, you have some racism in your teeth. Well, it's not quite that simple. And I think that's, no disrespect, I think that's a bit of an insult to the person who's being oppressed, and the group of people who are that the racism is being imposed on, because it's not like having spinach in your teeth. That's a very minor thing that is not, racism is life-threatening. And so it would be more similar to somebody's choking on a bone across the table from you, and you would immediately get out of your seat and rush to the other side of the table to perform the Heimlich maneuver to help them dislodge the bone from their throat. And so and it's more like having the bone in their throat as opposed to spinach in their teeth. And so, and I think when we're talking about racism, because it's life or death, and with it being life-threatening, you would casually and nonchalantly say, hey, there's some spinach in your teeth, but you wouldn't do the same. You wouldn't have the same type of aggression or urgency for someone choking on a bone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. No, I like the quote because it was pointing to why can't we talk about this more? But you're right. It's not funny right now. It's not lighthearted. So I definitely hear what you're saying.
It's even worse when you put the bone there. Like, not you per se, but in society. And so so it's a much harder comment. That's why you can't speak. You can't run around there to grab the bone and help them get it out, because it was you who put it there. So.
Yeah. The quote was much funnier when Boulay said it. Really not funny tonight. Not worth
no, but I get it. But and then I don't want to minimize the fact that some people really don't see it. That's it. So I born and raised in Chapel Hill, around extravagant wealth, lived on the other side of town. And I use the Power theme song. They say this is a big, rich town. I just come from the poorest parts. That's that really describes Chapel Hill for me, my experience. And so I have really very close friends who inherited wealth and inherited a lot of it. And when we talk about generations inheriting things, including beliefs and behaviors and so forth, it's very hard for them to understand, for example, when we have a conversation about the myth of meritocracy, that if you just work hard, you get to the top, and then all of a sudden you too have several $1 million sitting in a bank account, when they fail to see the connection between their parents and giving them, for example, as a wedding gift, a house that they just bought for them or something like that. They don't make those connections. So I get it. Some people just don't get it. And having conversations about racism and its effect, sometimes people they just don't get it. So I do want to say, I'm not suggesting that we don't have these conversations, but I am suggesting that there are sometimes, like when people are dying, that I don't feel like we need to have, it's not on me to educate you about how not to kill somebody.
There's no way to politely say, could you please take your knee off my neck? Yeah,
there's no way to politely. Thank you, Victor. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I did. Yeah. Some tools are not appropriate to some situations. One thing I want to go back to, though, Lacy, is your comment that the person who put the bone in my throat isn't going to be the one who I can turn to for help. That was one thing that came through the whole time you were talking, is like the screaming, heartbreaking irony of telling people this is your fault, this is your fault, this is your fault, when clearly so many pieces of the mosaic are setting people up to move in a certain direction. So I just wanted to acknowledge that really struck me. Well, panelists, thank you for your authenticity and for sharing so much. I'd like to move on to our Q&A, if that's okay. I'm going to skip the video because it's not really holding a candle to what we're doing here. Any final thoughts before we go to the Q&A? And I do have some housekeeping announcements before we do that as well.
I want to say you look beautiful, and you are an amazing moderator. And in the backdrop, I have to get one. That's all I want to say.
Give a link on Amazon. It's a sheet. So yeah. I'm sharing all my secrets here. All right, so I got to thank some people. Thank you to NAMI North Carolina Policy Director Ashish George on our chat box. Thanks to Wes Thomas on our tech support. And I want to thank Shireen Caraco, our originally scheduled guest for tonight. Shireen graciously offered to come back another time because she wanted to help make space for this conversation. And I think that was really appropriate and good-hearted of her. Okay, so we've got 4 questions in the Q&A box. If you are not familiar with how to ask a question on Zoom, you just want to look at the bottom of your monitor. There's a little Q&A icon, and type your question there. It will magically appear to us. Okay, first question. Could you all respond to Governor Cooper's announcement today of the new task force around this issue? And I'm going to let you guys jump in.
So it was a long time in the making, and what was interesting is that it was in the making before George Floyd. Part of it, and parts of it. And so to me, it speaks to the interconnectedness, going back to what Victor mentioned earlier, to the health disparities and to also other disparities in disparate treatment that we are seeing some communities experience. And so that's what I will say. I'm excited about it. I do think it's going to be critical, depending on how well and successful we are with lifting this. It could be transformative for North Carolina in a lot of ways, and from a structural and a systemic way.
Yeah, and I think I agree with Michelle. I also think that we're at a point where we all realize and recognize that it's not enough anymore just to say, I hear you, or, you know, I see your pain. We have to put some actions in place. And those actions need to be in the form of policies. And the way that we get there is we have to have some discussion, we have to have some dialogue, we have to do some research, we have to bring people to the table with lived experience as Black people in this country and let them be a part of the solution. So I applaud what the governor is doing. I would also add, though, that a lot of what you see coming out of the governor's office, coming out of DHHS, that speaks to the pain of communities of color is thanks to Dr. Michelle Laws, because she helps to push that, and she helps to craft a lot of what, you know, what you hear publicly. So she deserves some credit for that.
Lacy, did you want to add anything? Oh,
Thank you, Victor.
I think it's going to be hard to top those two, but I think I
A lot
should.
of people working.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to top that.
okay. Well, we've got quite a few more. 2 questions. Where is it best to start to make the changes you outlined? And 2, as a white person, what do you want me to do specifically to accomplish these changes?
I'll go first. I guess since I wasn't able to contribute to the last question, I would say, and that was Gary. Oh no, Gail.
That was Gail.
Gail. Gail. In terms of a start, is acknowledgement, just being accountable, and not only on your own account, but you know, not you personally, but just in terms of being, you know, acknowledging your privilege. I think I'm not here to tell anyone what to do. I think but as a Black man that lives in America with a Black son, I think that the idea that something that I want to highlight, something that Dr. Laws mentioned earlier, was that utilizing your voice in places where it can be heard, that my voice would not be heard, that our voices would not be heard, and to speak to your peers, and to hold your peers accountable, and to just advocate utilizing your privilege for the advancement, I guess, of any minorities or any person who's been discriminated against and unfairly and unequally, you know, I guess treatment of any unequal and unfair treatment. So just using your voice and your privilege to advocate, and your platform to advocate on behalf of those others, and just, you know, and listening, again, as I mentioned earlier, the willingness to listen. So.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we have to be willing to listen. I think the other thing that you have to be willing to do, and I think this is the heavy lift, is you have to be willing to accept the fact that the entire construct of what you believe the fabric of American society, American history, American laws to be may not be all that you think it is. That it has been built on the backs of enslaved people. It has been built by stepping on the rights of enslaved people. History has been told from the perspective of the majority, not from the perspective of the minority. We are a country that, in my opinion, and I love America, America has afforded me a lot of privileges, but we are almost psychotically optimistic in that we think that we can do anything to anybody, and God loves us best. So as long as we wrap ourselves in the flag and hold the Bible, that somehow makes us superior. And I think we have to be willing to take a good hard look at ourselves and say, maybe the very foundation that we have built a lot of our beliefs on, we need to dismantle it, go back and start from scratch, and reconstruct it all over again, and be inclusive, and stop telling me that I shouldn't be treated differently from you just because I am different. I'm not different.
Right.
From my perspective, you're the one that's different. So I'm not different. We should all be entitled to the same treatment. And just because the hue of my skin is darker than yours doesn't make me different. So I think we just got to go back and start from scratch and just rebuild our thought processes all over. And that's something for the long haul.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well said, Victor. That's coming out of the chat box. Are you guys ready for the next question then? All right. So this is from Gary, our executive director. Racism and injustice clearly cause significant trauma, not only to direct targets, for example, George Floyd and others, but to the larger African American community, but African Americans are statistically less likely to get needed mental health treatment as compared to others in our culture. How do we mitigate against the long-term psychological effects that this trauma is likely to produce among persons of color? How do people get the help they need?
Well, Victor said it early on. We've got to get more services and resources into communities where Black folk are. We need to get more Black people into treatment.
Yeah.
We need to address the stigma that is associated with people asking for help for all persons with mental illness, and especially in communities where there's a compounding effect with the stigma and then the lack of resources. So we need to make sure that we have services in some traditional, non-traditional places. We've got to make sure we continue to work with our faith communities. African Americans are still largely a Christian in many ways, and other religions as well, but largely a faith community of people. And so we've got to educate faith leaders more, continue to talk to them and provide resources for them to provide supports. I go to a church that is almost 6,000 members, and they have professionals, licensed therapists. They have all kinds of supports there. But the interesting thing is we don't have people utilizing some of the services that are available even in that. So part of it is the stigma. So you've got the services on one hand, but then you've got the stigma that's kind of, mitigating the effect of having a services there. So, or lessening the effect. So more services, deal with stigma, and certainly make sure that African Americans, it's not prioritizing, but that they are considered in the design of mental health responses. Because sometimes the responses are based on European models or white experiences, and not.
Yeah, and I agree with all. I grew up the son of a pastor in Plymouth, North Carolina, which your church has about as many people as I have in my hometown, Michelle. But growing up in the church, one of the things some of the things I learned about the church in the African American community is, one, the church is often the gateway into the community. The church is where we are socialized. The church is where we talk. We learn our politics. The church is also oftentimes the venue, the instrument that is utilized to let the rest of the world know what's important to the Black community. So I think there's a two-way street that we've got to do a better job of educating our pastors and our churches about how to deal with people that have mental illness, because I'd be the first to acknowledge that the church has also done a lot of damage to people in the way that in the African American community, the way that we've responded to people who are living with mental illness, telling people you just need to pray harder, you just need to get closer to God, you don't need to take medication, and we're just going to lay hands on you. That kind of thing has damaged a lot of people. But on the other hand, I think for outside entities, I worked at a hospital system prior to working for DHHS, and I would tell them there that we have done a decent job of trying to integrate behavioral health into primary care, trying to integrate primary care into behavioral health. But we have failed as trying to integrate behavioral health into the church, into the YMCA, into the community center, where people of color live and move and walk. If we are talking about addressing social determinants of health, at its core, social determinants of health is about getting people the services that they need, when they need them, where they need them, and in a way that they can receive them. And that's where I think we've got to be more intentional about putting those services into communities where people can access them and in ways that they will access them. There are different inroads into the African American community than there are into the white community, than there are into the Latino community. And we've got to be sensitive to those things.
All right, interesting comment from one of our veterans in the chat box, that the person has to be able to trust the institution that they're turning to for help. Really good point there. Next question from another veteran. Knowing, as Mr. Armstrong stated, that we have a lack or a shortage of mental health professionals, how or what added incentives can we offer to attract persons of color, especially men, to be available to be on that couch?
Are you talking about as clinicians? Is that what you understand the question?
It is.
Listen, I have and again, this is a kind of longer term down the road approach. But one of the things that I often think about is if you went to, the University of Georgia or Alabama or Clemson today, or State or North Carolina, they know today who's in 8th grade is going to be playing football for them 4 years down the road. Why can we not figure out how to look into these communities, these Latinx communities, African American communities, find young people who have the propensity to be tomorrow's psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, medical doctors, nurture them instead of pipelining them into foster care and prison. We can be pipelining them into being our clinicians of tomorrow. And then we don't have to worry about when we need somebody to go into the Hispanic community. Then we don't have to worry about if we need cultural competency, we don't just teach white people to speak Spanish and send them into the Hispanic community. We have a crop of folks that we are raising. So for me, that's one of the things that I think we need to start thinking about today. How do we begin to build that core of clinicians that we're going to need for people of color?
Excellent.
Boy, I love that football analogy. That really brings it home.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, next question. How can I help with word into action? I want to be part of helping to bring this change. It is really important to me.
Can I, in terms of words into action, how do you, I guess earlier Victor said there's no nice way to say get your foot off my neck, but I don't even know if there's a more plain way to say just, being a compassionate individual. No one's asking for special treatment for people of color. It's simply asking for normal treatment and equal treatment and fair treatment for people of color. And I think that it's, and sometimes and I guess the issue that we have is and this may be actually what this is where the knowledge of implicit bias could come into place. It's just becoming more knowledgeable of the different ways, the different systemic ways that racism and discrimination and bias and prejudice can be inflicted or imposed upon people of color and minorities and people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds. But spreading that knowledge and that information as far and wide as you can. And again, as I mentioned earlier, holding your peers accountable. Again, like Victor, the analogy Victor gave about the recruitment of football players and basketball players and athletes in general hit home with me as a former college athlete. But also in certain times, while there may have been a coach who was a coach of Caucasian descent that didn't demonstrate any racist behaviors, but there may have been a peer, a colleague, another coach, and that coach, in fear of rocking the boat and possibly losing his own livelihood, would sit back and not say anything about it. And I think that at this time, and with the climate of our country, and at this time and this point in 2020, gosh, that sounds crazy to say that we're still dealing with it, that this is not the time to be afraid to rock the boat. This is not the time to be afraid to speak up amongst your peers and colleagues and say, especially when we're talking about from a moral and ethical standpoint, hey, this is wrong. What you're doing is wrong. And maybe, and I've noticed that what you're doing is wrong, and maybe you're doing this because of, in demonstration of implicit bias, but maybe you're doing this because maybe you're just, this is a learned behavior, and this is a hateful form of racism, and not the implicit bias. So being conscious, being aware, that's what I think in terms of words to action, just being humane, being human, treating people with respect, being equal, being fair. And I don't know how much more plain that can be. It's like not to do it, nothing special. We're not asking you to, go on top of the building and somersault off and land on your feet. We're saying just treat people with respect and be and be equal.
Sure.
And I agree. And You know, I think part of it is just kind of being sick and tired of being sick and tired of having to like educate people how to treat people humanely. And I've gotten to the point, and I've been at different levels of this, you know. Part of what we do is educate, agitate, and litigate. That's the saying in the NAACP. We educate, agitate, and litigate. And that's what we do, right? You know, civil rights laws and da-da-da, that was the litigation. Then we do all this. So protest is the agitation. And so I've gotten to the point where, you know, some of the people who are acting in these really just horrible ways, inhumane ways, they've been around long enough. They've seen enough of history to know what's good and bad behavior when it comes to racism. And so I don't let people off the hook in terms of, well, they don't know. What we need more of is dialogue and education about racism and bias and da-da-da. I can't stress that enough. We do for people who have not, but some people have been around long. They've seen, you know, stories about Emmett Till. If they weren't taught about it in their home, they've seen the stories about Bull Connor unleashing the water hoses on Black and white protesters during the civil rights movement. They saw what happened. So I don't believe in letting people off the hook in terms of teaching people anything about humanity. We don't tolerate it in the Jewish community. Never. We don't even have, it's not even up for discussion. If there's you know, anti-Semitism, and we don't, it's never, oh well, let's have dialogue about, you know, no. Now what has been is people need to learn more about the Holocaust and the contribution of Jews and da-da-da. So it's in the textbooks and so forth now. But you know, we don't have this back and forth. Mm-hmm. Let's teach people how to treat members of the Jewish community. No, when something happens. No, when the mosques were bombed and there wasn't a whole lot of back and forth. It was, people are going to pay, period, because you knew better. Mm-hmm. You knew that was wrong. And so why is it when it comes, I just don't understand when it comes to killing an innocent or killing a Black person, and that all of a sudden part of the largest part of the explanation or the solution is more education about race. That's not our response to other cultures.
And I would add too, you know, I don't necessarily need for you to carry a sign. If you want to carry a sign and march with the protesters, I think that is great, because I think anyone who wants to put actions behind their thoughts, you know, I think that's good. If you want to speak out on social media or hold platforms like this, I think this is good. But what I need more than anything else is for you to see me. I need you to see me. I need you to feel my pain. And I don't need you to just see me because George Floyd just died. When the protesters go back into their homes, I still need you to see me and recognize that I'm hurting, that my sons are hurting, that my family, my people are hurting. And what I don't need for you to do is to make your good deed to be to go back and form a cultural competency committee and segregate these issues over in the cultural competency committee, and then bring something back to the group that we can sing kumbaya and go home and feel like we've done a good thing. We need change, and change comes from you feeling my pain. And if you need to remind yourself of what happens when you continue to look the other way, all you have to do is look out in the streets tonight, look on the news. This is what happens from continually good people, good Christian white people who have chosen to look the other way and not speak out when something was done wrong, not speak out when someone made a racist comment, not speak out when Trayvon Martin was killed. This is part of what brought us to this point. people who would not condemn things that they knew were wrong. So again, I don't need you to stand on the table and shout. I just need you to call it what it is.
Mm-hmm.
If you see a person of color who is mistreated, call it what it is. Don't rationalize it away and say, well, he must have done something to bring that on himself, because there is no way I could be living in a country that would allow a person to be treated badly like that. So he must have brought that on himself, and then I can go home and feel good about myself. We can't go back there. That's what brought us to where we are right now.
And I'm so happy to see go ahead, Lacy.
I was gonna say, to make things a little more realistic and from a political standpoint, if you're talking about policy and change, you said good Christian people, good Christian white people, God-fearing white people that will vote for a sheriff that has your own, and we all live in different areas of the state or the country, and you may go and come November 3rd, or whatever, midterm elections, you would vote for a sheriff or a county commissioner or a city councilman or a president who has made racially motivated comments or divisive comments, or has targeted and you reelect a sheriff who has a history of being under investigation for targeting minorities more often than Caucasians, and unfairly arresting and electing judges who are handing out lengthy sentences more often for nonviolent crimes to people of color and things of that nature. With this information, in 2020, again, this is the day of technology and information. This information is readily available to you, has been handed out to you, has been presented before you, and yet if you make those decisions, as you said, that's another slew of decisions that you may make without implicit bias, and not thinking about other people, because those are issues that may not affect you. Then this is what comes from it. This is the result. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Dr. Laws, Dr. Michelle, but I just...
You said, I was just going to say, I am encouraged by the diversity of the people who have taken to the streets, because those kids are saying to their ancestors, no longer will we continue to carry this burden that you have bequeathed us, right? This burden of hatred. And that I am my brother's keeper, and my brothers and sisters are me. I am them and they are me, regardless of the skin color. Dr. King said, what he will remember is not the hatred of his friends or something like that, but the silence of, the hatred of his enemies, but the silence of his friends. And so I challenge my friends, and, a friend of mine said, do you know, we were gossiping about some friends in Chapel Hill that we grew up with, said, do you know so-and-so's wife had the nerve to put a Trump sign in their yard? And I thought, and so when I called him, I said, why do y'all have this Trump sign in your yard, and so forth, so we went back and forth, and he was like, it's my, honey, Michelle was asking, why do we have this Trump, so it went on, and it was sort of funny until this dude won. And then I thought, this isn't funny. So, funny. Right. This is not funny. So even not giving people passes. So from now on, I'm like, look, you don't get a pass. No, you got some explaining to do.
Well, I know we have probably Trump supporters in our virtual studio audience, and I know some of them are awesome folks.
Yeah. I
want to kind of steer clear of politics.
I know, I agree, but that was it. So I'm holding people accountable for, there are no gray areas when it comes to justice. Either you're on the side of justice or you're not. You don't get to, too many lives have been lost, too many, even just too many lives have been lost for people who have waffled in there and wavered in their clear consciousness about where they stand. And if you've got people that are spewing hate, that are divisive, and this is on either side, it's not a political statement I'm making, I'm simply saying, you got people who degrading women and who are doing what, those are clear to me. And so now, and I brought that example up to say, you know, we laugh about it and we joke about it, even us, but we need to be very clear on where we stand, and we should not give people passes.
I agree
Well,
with that.
but part of that too, I think, is, again, we have to go back and question some of the constructs that we buy into, because when a politician says, vote for me because I'm tough on crime, you need to dig a little deeper in there. Are you just tough on crime when it comes to Black people? Are you tough on embezzlement? Are you tough on domestic violence? Are you tough on white collar crime? What do you mean when you say you're tough on crime? And I think people get a little bit bamboozled by that. I'm tough on crime, and the sheriff comes up and says, vote for me because I'm tough on crime and I had so many arrests last year. Well, but your neighbor across the street is beating his wife. You know that there's a child molester across the street that's not been convicted. But as long as you are arresting young Black men on the street who wear their pants low or who wear do-rags on their heads, you can see that. And so that makes you tough on crime. So I think, again, part of it, I think, is we have to not just allow things to be whitewashed. We have to ask the tough questions.
Thank you for that. And I mean, there's no excuse for racist behavior or sexist behavior, whoever the politician is. And we've seen way too much of that. So I definitely want to acknowledge that. It is 8:31, so we're really close to our ending point. Well, we're past it, but I don't want to just chop this to an end. I want to acknowledge the sort of the exhaustion and the frustration that I hear from y'all about, okay, what do you want us to do? It's how many times do we have to go through this? People are being killed. I really hear that, and I'm going to take that away and sit with it for a while. I also hear from the people asking the questions and the questions that I wrote, like, God, I hate that this is happening. I feel terrible. What can I do right now? Because I feel a lot of angst about it. So I just want to acknowledge that I think there's a lot to be said for that in terms of concrete actions. I'm just going to share what I've done. I joined the NAACP after watching Jimmy Fallon have a conversation with Derek Johnson, I think it is, the CEO. And I made a commitment to myself. I'm a conflict avoider, but I'm going to hang in there with that discomfort a little longer. And when a conversation goes in a direction where I know I need to speak my truth, which is against racism, I'm going to do that. I'm going to push myself. Yeah, I'm an introvert. Yeah, I get exhausted, whatever. This is important, and it's not something that you can just put on the shelf because it's inconvenient. Those are just examples. I hope they're helpful to someone. Hopefully I'm not talking too much already.
Heck, may I also say that, honestly, I really do think we're at a point where white people need to be talking to white folk, because I'm at the point where I don't know what to do. I can come up with an academic explanation and response. I can say what, I certainly am capable of doing that. But it's at the point where, it's not us that's doing it. So I can't explain it. And so I can't tell you how to tell people to stop it. At this point, I can tell you from a humanitarian perspective, because we're the victims of these violent and inexcusable acts. But I come to the conclusion, I really don't know what's in white people's head that makes them do that. And maybe part of the solution is asking some people that are close to like being racist or racist, like, tell me because they're more likely to share with you how to stop being that way or what really is fueling that than they are to me. And their response to an academic solution or a study or a policy change may be more reflexive than genuine, than deeply rooting it out. And
well, yeah, that's how do we have these conversations without putting people on the defensive so that the door is then shut? And I think of I can't remember the gentleman's name, National Public Radio did a story on him, an African-American gentleman who just became friends with a Klansman. He played in a jazz band, and this gentleman was attending his gigs, and they became friends, and he ended up changing this guy's mind. Anyways, a lot of big conversations here. I feel like we could go on all night. And I want to thank you guys for your patience and your authenticity. These are not easy questions, not easy issues. But let's end on this question from Gary. Well, the challenges are so large, what gives you hope?
I'll go first. The youth I work with each and every day. I see the compassion from blue, black, yellow, green, purple. The youth that I come in contact with each and every day. The compassion that they have for their peers, regardless of skin tone, regardless of cultural background and things of that nature. It gives me hope that we're not too far removed from where we want to be. I say, yeah, I know we still have quite a ways to go, maybe a couple of lifetimes. But I said, if these young people that I'm working with each and every day are going to be the leaders of tomorrow, and they're going to raise young people, I think that we're in better shape than worse in moving forward. I look around right now, and it does seem a little hopeless. It does seem the lights are a little dim. But I think that the young people that I work with each and every day, and I come in contact with, and that's been hundreds over the past year, they give me hope.
That's awesome.
So I'm not a fatalistic, person by nature. I'm a hopeful person just by the way I was raised, by in struggle, teenage mom, grandma sent her north, I stayed here. Once she graduated high school, my grandmother sent her north to create a better life, to do something with her life, and then come back and get her child and all of that. So that's, from struggle. Dad, who, was in military, came out, shot and killed a man, caught him, with his wife at the time. Sister killed by murder-suicide on campus while I was at UNC. 5-year-old sister dying in a house fire. Brother-in-law committing suicide. There's been a lot of trauma, and hope propels me forward and gets me out of bed every day. Hope in a God that I know, even through very difficult times, is behind the scenes and controlling things, and always, I believe, working things out together for my good. So I have hope. As in the words of the Black national, the Negro national anthem, when Hope Unborn had died, we still have hope. We are people that, we've had to have hope. And so hope is a part of my DNA, and it just is. I refuse to give in to evil. I refuse to give in to people who hate. I believe in the end of the day, as Dr. King says, love is always stronger than hate. And it takes time, but, and the moral arc of the universe is long, but it does bend eventually towards justice. So that's what keeps me hopeful. I've seen enough change and positive change.
Yeah, and I think for me, I am more naturally, I'm naturally pretty even-tempered about, the volume you heard from me tonight is about as loud as I get. But I am by nature a more hopeful person than pessimistic, just because I think I'm probably just too lazy to be pessimistic. It takes too much energy to be pessimistic. So I try to be hopeful. But I do agree with Michelle. I think for Black people, we talk about trauma being in our DNA and pain being in our DNA, but hope is in our DNA, because hope and perseverance is always what has brought us through. And one of the ways that I have fed that hope in these last few weeks is, as last Friday, I was driving from Raleigh to Charlotte, and I picked up the phone and I called a couple of white male friends of mine. And I told them, I just need to hear some reassurance. I need to talk with somebody that can give me some hope. And I needed to hear it from one of my white friends. And it's very easy, I think, for us to all go into our corners and surround ourselves with the people who look like us and come from where we come from. But every now and then, I think we need to build and feed that hope by reaching out to someone who's different from us and reminding ourselves that there's beauty in that difference. So that's what gives me hope.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end on. I really want to thank each of our panelists, Victor Armstrong, Dr. Michelle Laws, Lacy Flintall. You really shared a piece of your heart and a piece of your experience with us. A lot of wonderful comments in the chat box. I'll send you the chat box if you're interested later. Thank you for joining us on short notice. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience and insight with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to spend time with my NAMI family and friends. So thank you.
All right.
Did a great job, Peg.
Thank you.
Get a proxy for me.
I sure will. All right. So 90 minutes has flown by, 100 minutes in this case. I want to encourage everyone to be well in the weeks ahead. Take care of yourself. Go where you need to go. Do what you need to do to be safe. And that's the end of our show tonight. I look forward to moving forward. We are going to be talking more about injustice, race, and recovery. We're setting up meetings to continue the conversation, so please stay tuned. And thank you again for joining us.
Okay. This looks like it's getting ready to eat you back there.
This is my safe space. Okay, I got to hit stop record before I